Here we want to be able to evaluate the integral going from lower bound of 0 to the upper bound of 2 times the square root of 3 of x cubed divided by the square root of 16 minus x squared dx. Okay, so what we want to do is we're going to let x equal 4 times the sine of theta. Okay, so in this particular problem, we're going to let x equal 4 times the sine of theta. Okay, now we need to figure out where theta has that restriction. So that means where theta is going to be in between pi over 2 and negative pi over 2. So therefore, dx is going to equal the the derivative of 4 sine of theta, which is going to be 4 times the cosine theta d theta. Okay, so now the reason why we're choosing that is because of the square root of 16 minus x squared. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So if we if we say that the square root of 16 minus x squared is then equal to 16 minus 4 times the sine of theta squared, well then that equals 16 minus 16 sine squared theta. And so if we factor out the 16, we get 1 minus the sine squared theta. And what do we know about that trig identity? Well, that trig identity tells us that this now becomes the square root of 16 times the cosine squared theta. And so if we take, that's a perfect square, so if we take the square root of that, we get 4 times the absolute value of the cosine of theta, which then becomes 4 times the cosine of theta. So now we need to determine what is our function going to look like, and then what do we do with the upper and lower bounds. So let's go ahead and write our integral. So we're going to go from 0 2 times the square root of 3, and this now is x cubed over the square root of 16 minus x squared dx. And now we're going to go ahead and do our substitutions. Okay, so our substitutions tells us what? Well, we know that x is going to be 4 times the sine of theta. So this is going to be 4 times the sine of theta cubed. And then we also know that the square root of 16 minus x squared is equal to 4 times the cosine of theta. So you're going to divide it by 4 times the cosine of theta. And then we know that dx is going to equal 4 times the cosine of theta d theta. Okay, so now we need to determine what is our upper and lower bound. So we know that x is 2 times the square root of 3. So that means that x is equal to 4 times the sine of theta. So that means that 2 times the square root of 3 is going to equal 4 times the sine of theta. And over here, again, x is going to equal 4 times the sine of theta. So that means 0 is going to equal 4 times the sine of theta. Okay, so now what we want to do is we're going to figure out what is the upper and lower bounds. So let's take a look at the upper bound. So here we have 4 times the sine of theta, which is equal to 2 times the square root of 3. Divide both sides by 4. The sine of theta is equal to square root of 3 over 2. And so what is the angle when you take the sine of it is going to give you the square root of 3 over 2? Well, that tells us that theta is going to equal pi over 3. So now we know what our upper bound is. So our upper bound is going to be pi over 3. Okay, now we want to determine what is the lower bound. So 4 times the sine of theta is equal to 0. Divide both sides by 4. The sine of theta is equal to 0. So what is theta when the sine of theta is equal to 0? Well, that means that theta is going to equal 0. So therefore, our lower bound is 0. Okay. And so now, what do we know about our upper? So we have 4 cubed times the sine cubed theta times 4 times the cosine of theta over 4 times the cosine of theta d theta. Well, that tells us that we can now simplify 4 times the cosine of theta over the 4 times the cosine of theta. And then we can factor out the 4 cubed, going from 0 to pi over 3. And then we have the sine cubed theta d theta. So now what do we need to do? Well, we now need to then factor sine of cubed theta a little further. So we have 4 to the third power going from 0 to pi over 3. So we have sine squared theta times the sine of theta d theta. And so what do we know about the sine squared theta? Well, we know that that is 1 minus the cosine of theta. So 4 cubed going to 0 to pi over 3. Well, the trig identity sine squared theta is 1 minus cosine squared theta times the sine of theta d theta. So now we need to do another substitution. So we're going to do our u substitution. So for this integral here, we're going to let u equal the cosine of theta and we're going to let du, which is going to equal negative sine theta d theta. So now looking at this integral, we have 4 to the third power, which now becomes 64, going from 0 to pi over 3 of 1 minus the cosine squared theta times the sine of theta d theta. And so now let's go ahead and then evaluate. So we're going to go ahead and we still have 64 here. And we have 1 minus the cosine of theta, which is now going to become 1 minus u squared. And we have sine theta d theta. So we need to now rewrite this statement to be negative du, which is equal to the sine theta d theta. So that becomes negative du. And now we're going to go ahead and now factor out this negative. Before we factor out the negative, we still need to determine what is our new upper and lower limits. So u is equal to the cosine of theta. So that is cosine of pi over 3. And u is equal to the cosine of theta. So that is the cosine of 0. So we have negative 64. The cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. The cosine of 0 is 1. And we have 1 minus u squared du. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take the antiderivative. So we have negative 64 times the antiderivative of 1 is going to be u, minus the antiderivative of u squared is going to be 1/3 u to the 3rd power. And then we're evaluating it from 1 to 1/2. And so let's go ahead and then substitute. So we have negative 64 times the following. So we have 1/2 minus 1/3 times 1/2 cubed minus 1 minus 1/3 times 1 cubed. So we have negative 64. This becomes 1/2 minus 1 over 24. Minus over here, since this is 1, we're going to call that 3 over 3. Minus 1/3 times 1, which is 1/3. Okay, so let's find a common denominator. So we can see that the common denominator is going to be 24. So we have 12 over 24 minus 1 over 24. And then let's distribute those. So we have minus 24 over 24. And that's plus 8 over 24. So we have negative 64. So we have 12 minus 1, which is 11. And 11 minus 24 is negative 13. And negative 13 plus 8 is negative 5 over 24. We know that a negative times a negative is going to give us a positive. And we know that 8 goes into 24 3 times. We know 8 goes into 64 8 times. So we're going to get 40 over 3 as our result.